This program is made possible by listeners who choose to support Frontlines and Backrooms. You can join our community of supporters through the link in the episode description. Thank you.
From Lisbon, Frontlines and Backrooms podcast. Your host, Vladimir Bobatic.
Today we are joined by a guest who has spent 3 decades navigating some of the most complex legal front lines in international politics. At the moment when the international order is being tested, from intervention in Venezuela to strikes of Operation Epic Fury in Iran, her voice is one of the few that can help ground the conversation in law rather than rhetoric. Mona Khalil is a respected public international lawyer with more than 30 years of experience in the United Nations system. As a former senior legal officer, she advised on the sharpest edges of international peace and security, from sanctions and counter-terrorism to weapons of mass destruction disarmament, and served on special assignments during the conflicts in Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Her expertise also extends into the nuclear domain. During her time at the International Atomic Energy Agency, she advised on nuclear security and issues related to Iranian sanctions compliance. Today, she is an independent strategic consultant, a faculty member at the Vienna Diplomatic Academy, and an affiliate of the Harvard Law School program of International Law and Armed Conflict. She is also the co-editor of the recent book Empowering the United Nations Security Council: Reforms to Address Modern Threats. Ms. Khalil, welcome to Frontlines and Backrooms. It is an honor to have you with us today.
My pleasure and privilege completely.
One of the things that it is trending at the moment is international law, but for all bad reasons. As I mentioned, you spent more than 2 decades inside the UN legal office. Right now, we are watching a war where international lawyers overwhelmingly say the strike on Iran exceeded self-defense. Yet Western allies are mostly silent or supportive. From inside the system, is international law being ignored, or is it simply not designed for this moment?
It's definitely designed for this moment, precisely for such moments. It is designed to stop the scourge of war, to stop the attacks on the political sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Nobody said only those states that have clean human rights records and only those states that are popular deserve those rights. Every state is protected. If we're going to start off by talking about Iran, then immediately I condemn the regime. I condemn most of all its treatment of its own people. However, Iran as a state, regardless of its regime, has the right to territorial integrity and the right to political sovereignty like every other state in the UN system. It is a member of the UN. It is a party to the NPT. It is a participant in the negotiations, successfully concluded a joint comprehensive plan of action that was implemented without breach for several years and succeeded in allaying some of the concerns about the confidence deficit and the peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear program. And it is the very parties who are now waging war on the state of Iran that had torn apart that agreement and brought us to the brink of yet potentially a conflict that could not only conflagrate in the region, as has already been done, but could morph into a third world war, given the interests of other superpowers, other nuclear powers. We cannot forget the irony that on the pretext of a nuclear program that has been time and again confirmed by the IAEA as lacking any evidence that there has been any weaponization, nonetheless, the two nuclear states, one a known nuclear state, the U.S., and one an undeclared nuclear state, but equally known to be a nuclear state, with an arsenal, and the only arsenal in the Middle East, are the ones attacking Iran for a potential nuclear program, one that the IAEA has yet to find any evidence that has either been politically decided to pursue such a program, much less to militarily and practically pursue such a program. Again, I do not mean in any way to imply that I support this regime or that I do not condemn the atrocities that this regime is responsible for. However, if we're talking about aggression and we're talking about international law, we cannot talk about Iran's retaliatory attacks without talking about the initial aggression that is the US and Israeli attack on Iran. Now, Iran is capable of violating the rules of war in its retaliatory strikes against US bases and against Israel, and is probably guilty of several war crimes in that regard. But the supreme crime, as adjudicated by the Nuremberg Tribunal, is aggression, because, as the Nuremberg Tribunal said, it is the sum of all the other crimes. It is the birthplace of all of those other crimes. So we cannot hold Iran accountable, and we must hold Iran accountable, without also holding the US and Israel accountable for triggering this regional conflict through its aggression against Iran and the obvious consequence of such an attack, which is that Iran has the right of self-defense, like any other state, to respond to those attacks.
You mentioned two very important things, and that is the interest of other superpowers in the region and the term that everybody is afraid of, World War III. For the regional conflict, we understand the dynamics of the conflict. Can you lead us step by step on how a regional war of this scale can lead us to world war?
Multiple potential escalations. The first is, first of all, not a nuclear war, but if the attacks affect the nuclear facilities of Iran, that could trigger leaks of radiation. It could trigger nuclear crisis, even if it's not a nuclear war. That's one danger that could happen. Another is that either the U.S. or Israel feel that they're losing strategically. They may win, the daily attacks, and they may cause a tremendous destruction and damage. They're also causing a lot of loss of innocent life, including children. But let's say that they feel that despite their immense superiority militarily, that they are nonetheless losing strategically. They may consider using nuclear weapons themselves. The U.S. is already the only country that has used nuclear weapons in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and let's not lose sight of that historical fact. But if Trump and or the coterie of other advisors around him feel that their victory is a strategic option and that loss, on any sense of loss, is not a strategic option, then they may themselves consider using nuclear tactical or strategic weapons. Israel, when facing potential defeat in 1973, has now been historically documented, considered using nuclear weapons. It may do so again. The third potential area of risk is that the superpowers become embroiled. Russia and China have interests in Iran. They have already indicated that they will not sit idly by for much longer. And therefore, if the conflict continues, the potential, both in Iran as well as in Ukraine, if the conversation devolves into the hyperbolic, hostile trajectories that we are witnessing, these days, it could become that there is no mechanism to come back from the brink, where their threats could become material reality, whether it's U.S. and Russia, U.S. and China, or whether the case may be. So there's multiple triggers of potential, not just world war, but potential nuclear confrontation.
Superpowers sitting in the United Nations Security Council, 5 permanent members, are enjoying one superpower. Council was created in 1945 around a veto power. You co-edited a book on Security Council reform. Is the Council still relevant, or we are watching an institution that it is already obsolete and ready to be modernized?
The council is definitely relevant. The fact that it's failing does not make it irrelevant. The failure itself is a danger. The failure itself is a threat to international peace and security. So it's very relevant. And its successor failure is as much a part of the state of the legal and political order as anything else. The violations of the permanent members themselves, we have at least 4 of the 5 guilty of major grave crimes. The US and UK invading Iraq, the Russians invading Ukraine, and crimes also committed in Syria by the Russians. Let's not forget those. The Chinese, who are facing potential crimes against humanity and possible ethnic cleansing against the Uyghur people, You have the UK guilty of the US invasion of Iraq, which was also an aggression in my view. And of course, the more recent escalation of multiple aggressions by the United States, Venezuela, as well as Iran. You have the shielding by all of these permanent members of others who are committing grave atrocities. US protecting Israel against what the ICJ has deemed to be a plausible genocide. You have the Russians' long and sordid history of protecting the likes of Bashar Assad and Bashir in Sudan, as well as many others. You have the Chinese protecting Myanmar against the plausible genocide, again, deemed by the ICJ against the Rohingya people. So we have genocides conflagrating in Sudan against the Darfuri people, in Myanmar against the Rohingya people, against the Palestinian people in Gaza. And those perpetrators, Israel, Myanmar, the Sudanese parties, are being shielded by their allies who are permanent members in the Security Council and others as well. So this is far from the vision of the Charter, far from the responsibilities of the permanent members under the Charter, but also under the Genocide Convention, also under the Common Articles of the Geneva Conventions. They are not just failing, they are violating their own binding jus cogens ergo omnes obligations. This is the most binding type of obligation. And there's no recognition of this, not just on their part, but no accountability whatsoever by the General Assembly, no accountability by the broader membership, or by, that seems to have been normalized. It seems to have been accepted. The word veto doesn't even appear in the Charter. The only thing that appears is the term the concurring votes of the permanent members. So yes, they have that power. It's a power they enjoyed before the UN was formed. It's a power they enjoyed from the League of Nations, where every state had a veto. That obviously wasn't workable. But in order to keep the permanent members as members and to stay as members, they had to continue to enjoy that veto. But it was meant to be used when their supreme interests were at stake. It was not meant to be abused. And they made promises when the founding of the Charter that they wouldn't abuse it. But now they seem to only know how to abuse it. But let me just make one more comment, if I may. Even when the Council is acting, it is becoming a threat. Some of these resolutions that are being adopted, in some cases under duress, I understand, but still they're being adopted, are very dangerous. The resolution on the Board of Peace has positive elements, but it also has very dangerous elements. That was adopted in the Security Council. The recent resolution condemning Iran, also dangerous. While everything in it is a reflection of a certain transgressions and violations and even possible war crimes by Iran, it cannot be understood that this retaliatory phase can be mentioned and condemned without the triggering event, which is the US and Israeli aggression against Iran. That lack of context is lethal, not just to any political resolution, but to the legal understanding of the criminal context that we're operating in. So even when it's acting, the Security Council can be failing to uphold the legal order, the Charter, and the international legal framework, not only when it's failing to act.
Ms. Khalil, how can we reform the Security Council if the permanent members who are using and abusing a veto power and who are not ready to willingly accept losing that tool? Without them, how can we reform that part of the United Nations?
Again, we don't have to amend the Charter in order to reform the UN. Amending the Charter is only one way. The book that you mentioned, Empowering the UN Security Council, Reforms to Address Modern Threats, has 10 chapters. Each chapter is a way to overcome the veto without amending the Charter. The idea is that if the Council and broadly the United Nations is going to live up to its mandate, to its responsibility, it has to rely on the existing tools. Because even in the scenario where the General Assembly tomorrow adopts amendments to the Charter, they will not enter into force until we see the Permanent Five ratify them in their legislatures, not just in their executives. Even the amendment about removing Italy and Germany as enemy states has yet to enter into force. How many years ago was that adopted? It has yet to enter into force. I mean, so imagine how many years probably infinite number of years before the P5 even agree to restrain the use of the veto, which is something that's built into the charter. The charter says that the council, and therefore the members of the council, must act in accordance with the purposes and principles of the charter, Article 24. That is not even mentioned, much less respected, much less upheld, much less enforced. Existing tools must be used, must be tapped. Another thing is the General Assembly uniting for peace. Yes, we have the emergency special sessions on Palestine and Ukraine. Yes, they have woken up the sleeping elephant of the General Assembly that has tremendous power. But my chapter is on how much more the GA can do, not based on vision, not based on ideas or ideals, but based on actual precedents, historical precedents, where the GA has already done this, where the GA has authorized peacekeeping forces, has recommended sanctions, has recommended arms embargoes, has provided for military assistance and humanitarian assistance, not just to defending states, but also to national liberation organizations. So there's a range of measures that the General Assembly has already taken that it can again take. At a minimum, the Secretariat can do more. It can put forth peace plans, elements of peace plans. It can offer to mediate. It can offer um, to assist in the investigation and preparation of cases, as as the General Assembly has asked that it be done for Myanmar and in Syria. It can do so for other areas of conflict and mass atrocity as well. You also have the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, which I believe we must pay tribute to. When people say the law is failing, the law is the only thing that's working. The ICJ is issuing judgments in contentious cases and issuing advisory opinions that are dealing with almost every subject of human society at the moment. The threats like war and genocide, including the war in Ukraine and the genocides that I mentioned, in against the Rohingya and against the Palestinian people in Gaza, but also other threats, existential threats, the nuclear threat. There's an advisory opinion. The climate change threat. There's an advisory opinion. So the ICJ, despite tremendous pressure sometimes, is doing its job. The International Criminal Court is holding individuals accountable. That is its mandate. It was applauded when it issued arrest warrants against Putin, but it was condemned when it issued an arrest warrant against Netanyahu. The number of civilians who have been killed in Ukraine is a fraction, after 4 years, of the number of civilians that have been killed in Gaza. Literally a fraction. By the biggest count, it's 15,000 civilians in Ukraine. It's over 75,000 in Gaza in half the time, in a fraction of the territorial area. So when the International Criminal Court, despite the sanctions against its prosecutor and its judges, despite tremendous intimidation and threats, despite the restriction on its resources, is doing its job. So for me, the only pillar of the legal order and the political order that is actually functioning is the legal order. What we need now is more responsible membership, more responsible leadership. The political order is where the failures lie.
You mentioned the Board of Peace. You also spoke in Vienna last month about the UN's 80th anniversary and the rise of alternative mechanisms like the Board of Peace. The board was actually approved, as you said, by the Security Council. It will have troops from multiple countries in Gaza and the mandate over Gaza. Is this reform or replacement? And what does it mean for the UN's charter mandate role?
Indeed. I'm so glad that you asked me this question. The Board of Peace that is approved in Resolution 2803 of the United Nations Security Council and the Board of Peace that was launched in Davos and that met recently are not the same Board of Peace. The Board of Peace that is in the resolution is strictly limited to Gaza, has a finite time period through the end of through December 2027. It talks about the need for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. It talks about territorial protection, such as no annexation, no occupation, no forced displacement. It talks about the vision of a two-state solution, Israel and Palestine living in peace and security. It talks about the self-determination of the Palestinian people. It talks about a path towards a political resolution that takes us to that vision. If you look at the charter that was signed in Davos, there's not even a mention of Gaza or even the Middle East. It's a completely, as you said, a separate entity that has nothing to do with the entity approved by the council and therefore should not be equated with it. And the council should call out the fact that this is not the body it had endorsed. That body does indeed have the imprimatur, the indicia of seeking to replace. Not only does its logo replicate the logo of the UN, not only the use of the term charter, not only the use of the term an organ for peace and security, and therefore I agree. The Board of Peace that has been launched in Davos and is meeting currently does not resemble and certainly does not have the legal basis endorsed by Security Council Resolution 2803. Now, whether it's a force for good or force for evil, I mean, one can predict based on the $1 billion membership fees and the lifetime chairmanship, not only of the country concerned, but of the individual concerned, which violates all of the, let's call them, best practices of international organizations, that membership rotate not only from individuals but amongst nations and amongst regions, representing the different, not just the different regional groupings, but also the different systems of government and the system and different legal systems. So I mean, that's just the least of why it's objectionable. Now, if I were a country that is contemplating deploying my troops in the name of such an entity, I should demand assurances before I deploy that my mandate is consistent with the mandate approved by the Security Council, that my troops are governed by legal principles and the protections of international humanitarian law, and are governed, that their conduct and rules of engagement should be governed by international humanitarian law, that the goal of the deployment is consistent not only with 2803, but consistent with the UN Charter and international law. I would not put my troops in harm's way, whether on the border with Israel and or within the occupied Palestinian territory, without those assurances. I have a duty to the men and women I'm deploying. I have a state responsibility to make sure that the troops I'm deploying respect those principles and fulfill those principles and know what they're fighting for.
In the first meeting, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair first mentions 25 miles of the Gaza coastline before anything about rebuilding Gaza and the future of the people there. US Vice President J.D. Vance was talking about the economic benefits for US citizens. The President of the United States said the UN is failing institution, but that he and countries that he got on the Board of Peace can help the UN financially, and that he already has in mind some good people who can run the United Nations. Honestly, are you alarmed? Is it a time for a panic when you hear all of that?
I think the time for panic was a while ago. I think now is the time to wake up and do something about it. Panic only creates greater chaos and greater crime and greater destruction. What we need is principled leadership, courage of conviction, and we need a plan. We need a vision. We need to rally around. I mean, it was less than a year and a half ago where the entire membership of the UN vowed by consensus at the head of state level that they're committed to the UN, committed to the rule of law, committed to multilateralism. Now we hear them, even in the EU at the Davos, talking about international law is dead and the UN is irrelevant. It was a year and a half ago that they vowed that these were the not just the ideals, but the practical imperative of survival, that we cannot deal with the threats that we're facing, whether it be violent threats and the increasing violence, and or the existential threats like climate change and AI and nuclear proliferation and all of the others. How can the difference from a year and a half be that? The change in circumstance was the election of Trump. Are we going to throw that all away for one man? So I think we need to, if possible, work with the President of the United States on bringing him closer to that international legal framework that, after all, the United States was a vanguard in the creation of that legal framework. It's a universal framework. All the members of the UN, both the founding members and the subsequent members, have signed on to it. It's a universal charter. But the United States' role, as with the role of the other permanent members, cannot be ignored. They voluntarily undertook to respect these prohibitions and to respect these principles because they saw it as a pathway to survival. They saw the consequences of failing to respect those rules in World War II and in the Holocaust. And the promise of not repeating those mistakes is one that should continue to guide us if we dispense with those lessons at our own risk. And it's not just a risk of war here or war there, it's an existential risk, both in terms of the planet as well as mankind. So it's a practical imperative that we live up to those principles and that we honor those prohibitions and that we enforce them when they're violated. It's in our very selfish national and human interest to do so. And as far as the permanent members concerned, if they gleefully allow the UN and the UN Security Council to be destroyed, that is the source of their power. That is the recognition of the international community that they have power. Even when the geostrategic reality has shifted from the composition of 1945, they have the power. If they want to keep the power, they should be the ones most jealously guarding that legal order, that political order. They should be the ones making sure that their resolutions are enforced, making sure that the charter is respected, because that is the basis on which they are permanent members. That is the basis on which they have the veto. If they dispense with that whole system, they are ultimately destroying the underpinnings of their own standing and their own position in the legal and political order.
Let's talk a little bit more about their attitudes toward international law, especially from some EU member countries regarding the war in Iran. It looks like there is a striking gap between scholars who say that strikes are unlawful and what the politicians are saying. Germany says legal classification will have relatively little effect. The Netherlands says international law isn't the only framework. Belgium says the principle of reality matters. When you hear senior officials from EU member countries openly dismissing legal constraints, what is actually happening to the system you spent 25 years inside?
Yeah, I mean, I think the EU's hypocrisy is much earlier and much broader than its hypocrisy on the situation in Iran. But you had mentioned Tony Blair, and I was remiss in not addressing that. There's so much to address. Tony Blair is the last person that should be sitting on a board of peace. He's as much a war criminal and an aggressor as Putin is. When we talk about aggression, the US-UK aggression against Iraq, the minimum million who died on the Iraqi side and the untold thousands who died on the US and UK side have not been accounted for. We cannot say that Tony Blair, the fact that he has been appointed or anointed an envoy of peace by the quartet is a shame on the entire international community. He is as much of a war criminal and an aggressor as Putin is in my eyes. And the fact that he used his mantle to self-servingly accrue profit from the suffering and the loss of life that he was responsible for makes it all the more egregious. And those who have helped him compile those profits are aiding and abetting a war criminal. And instead of the international community demanding that he be held accountable for those war crimes, they are rolling out red carpets and they are anointing him with titles. It's shocking. It's absolutely shocking. The same with former President Bush, who's also, par excellence, the war criminal who initiated that war. And again, on false pretext, I might add, similar to the false pretext we have on the nuclear file today. So these are the double standards, not just of the US and the UK, but of the entire international community that has allowed this without comment. That when the UN quartet appoints Tony Blair for a special coordinator, a special envoy for the occupied Palestinian territory. That's a travesty of justice. He himself was committing not just aggression, but illegal acts of occupation within Iraq. For him to oversee an occupation in Palestine is beyond hypocritical. It's dangerous. And his any role that he plays, I'm glad he was demoted as the originally intended person on the ground. I believe now it's meant to be Mr. Mladenov. But Tony Blair is talking about the coast of Gaza, not just because of the potential Riviera that he and Trump envision. It's because of the untold treasures and gas and natural gas reserves that have been discovered off the coast of Gaza that belong to the Palestinian people. The national sovereignty over the natural resources, both on land and in the territorial waters, belong to the Palestinian people. If that right, if that sovereignty, if that ownership is recognized, they can rebuild their own Gaza. They can rebuild their own state. They don't need anybody else to do so. If they're not being robbed of their lives and robbed of their treasure off the coast of Gaza, they could do it, and they have the both the legal as well as the talent to do so, the legal rights and the talent to do so. But if it's being robbed blindly before our very eyes, and people are lining up to reward the perpetrators of the theft as opposed to punishing them and calling for their accountability, then those complicit states, those complacent states are just as guilty as those who are doing the robbing and the pillaging and the raping. And I might add the murder and the starvation that is happening in that very area. So we have a lot to answer for as a international community, as a human family. It's time for vigilance. It's not time for panic. It's time for action. It's not time for panic.
We all know how diplomacy works. Pressure is sometimes implemented behind closed doors. Until recently, we had a kind of diplomatic way to deal with these situations. What stuns me is that in this moment, no one is hiding their derogatory attitude about international law and their hypocrisy about its implementation. Recently, US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth said this, and I quote, "No stupid rules of engagement, no politically correct wars, we fight to win." That's not a legal argument. It is a dismissal of law entirely. When officials at that level speak this way, what does it signal to other states about the rules of the game?
Right. But again, this isn't the first time. I mean, we seem to focus on Trump and Trump's cabinet. Didn't Bush and his administration say that the Geneva Conventions are quaint and maybe no longer relevant? Have they not decimated the UN Charter with their actions, if not their words? Hasn't Israel declared the Secretary General persona non grata merely for calling for a ceasefire? Has Putin not tried to describe his aggression against Ukraine as a peacekeeping operation? When the words lose their meaning, when motives are so blatant and yet cloaked and clothed in such noble principles, then we, by using that language, by not holding that language accountable, we are allowing the distortion of the basic reality. We're allowing them to create their own reality, and then we cannot, you know, help normalize these deceptions and these lies, and then say, "Oh, how did we get to this point?" When we sit there and we applaud President Bush's paintings of puppies and portraits of other world leaders without mentioning that he's a war criminal and an aggressor, when we roll out the red carpet for Tony Blair when he committed one of the biggest atrocities in human history, which I believe was the original break in the UN framework. When Netanyahu can go to the U.S. Congress and get untold dozens of standing ovations while he's murdering children, and while he's dragging the U.S. against the interests of the United States and Israel, I might add, into an unpredictable conflagration with Iran and the rest of the region and other potential world powers, applause, 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 then we're just as guilty.
Ms. Khalil, you were inside the room during the Syrian weapons of mass destruction crisis and the aftermath of the Iraq invasion. When you see these same patterns repeating themselves in 2026, do you feel a sense of deja vu, or does this moment feel fundamentally more dangerous than what you saw before?
I think they're inextricably linked. I think it was a domino that started with the Iraq War that is still unfolding. When we had two of the intended guardians of that legal and political order that I refer to, which is the UN Charter and the multilateral order, basically disregard their own obligations, manufacture evidence as pretext for war, and disregard the clear will of their fellow permanent members and the entire international community and the entire human family that was marching in the streets the way they're marching now in the streets against what's happening in the Middle East and Palestine and Sudan and elsewhere. So it's the same phenomenon where you have rogue leaders who are empowered and enabled and not held to account for criminal activity. And then we move on to the next crime without accountability. I can't imagine that Russia would have so easily considered its invasion in 2022 had its invasion in 2014 had greater consequence of Ukraine. And the fact that the US, which has always, at least since the World War II, has had a disproportionate political as well as military power, to be able to use it with such blatant disregard for rules that are in the US's own laws, not just against international law. This will undermine US interests. Clearly, we see that already economically, politically. The country is falling apart at the seams. The people are divided. There's no support for the war in Iran. The economy is creating the exact opposite effects of what the President Trump promised his own constituency. So the consequences are almost in real time. But there's much greater consequence coming for the region, much greater consequence coming to the rest of the world if this is not stopped. And if the bleeding doesn't stop, and the striking doesn't stop, and the blatant impunity doesn't stop. We keep saying we're at the brink. We're about to fall off the brink. So I think that wake-up call is needed.
One of Israel's legal arguments to justify this war is that Iran's support for proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthis, constitutes an ongoing armed attack justifying self-defense. Does that argument hold at all? And if it does, what happens to the law when every state with adversaries can claim the same thing?
Indeed, I mean they all have allies. They all have proxies, and neither Iran is in a position to point a finger, nor is Israel in a position to point a finger. They follow the same tactics and the same strategies. But let's have a reality check. Hamas was in large part emboldened and created from its inception by Israel because they wanted to weaken Arafat and the PLO, and the divide and conquer a policy of Netanyahu is something he brags about. He wanted to divide the West Bank from Gaza. He wanted to divide the Palestinian leadership. He wanted to funnel money via Qatar to Hamas in order to make it even less likely that anybody would, by his own account, to his own cabinet, to ensure that there is no demand on Israel to give up occupied territory because the Palestinian leadership itself is divided. So that is one part of the Hamas story. So even if you remove Hamas, they are now, what is Israel doing now? It's funding these tribal factions in order to weaken Hamas. So they're doing to Hamas what they did to the PLO by sponsoring and financing Hamas. Now they're sponsoring and financing these even more, I would say, anarchistic entities, which are potentially more dangerous. So they're making the same mistake again. They're creating their own Frankensteins, the same way the U.S. Helped the Taliban and helped establish Al Qaeda to get the Russians out of Afghanistan, and then they created their own Frankenstein, which came back time and time again. The same with Hezbollah. Hezbollah didn't exist until the Israelis invaded Lebanon in 1978 and again in 1982. The same with the Houthis. So I mean, the when you're creating not just the realities that give birth to these opposition groups, but when you are prolonging occupation in Palestine, occupation in Lebanon, a complete decimation of all infrastructure in Yemen, when you are releasing Al Qaeda prisoners in order to give rise to consternation and civil war in Yemen, then you cannot be surprised when elements who resist that foreign occupation, which at the end of the day is part of international law, the right to resist legitimate armed action, including armed action against foreign occupation. The Houthis have that right, Hezbollah has that right, Hamas has that right. Where they become criminal is in that they exercise that right without regard to the laws of war. The same way Israel has the right to self defense, but also has to respect the laws of war. They're guilty of war crimes. They're guilty of crimes against humanity, as deemed by the International Criminal Court, not because they don't have a right to self defense. Of course, they have a right to self defense, but there are rules to that right to self defense. And the movements of national resistance have that right, but they also have rules that they are violating. Now, Iran has a right to self defense against Israel and the United States attacks, but it too must respect the rules of war. Is it attacking the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of its neighboring states, or is it attacking a legitimate military target of the United States, a legitimate military target of Israel? But one, it sends missiles without discrimination, indiscriminately. When it sends missiles to civilian areas, then it is also guilty of these excesses, of these war crimes. The same way the US and Israel have committed war crimes by bombing schools and by bombing civilian areas and by bombing residential areas, admitting that they're bombing residential areas, not just this year, but last year as well. So all of these, yes, they have rights rooted in international law, but they've all violated by their excesses, by their disproportionate use of force, by their indiscriminate use of force, and worse yet, by their intentional targeting of civilians. And state and non-state actors have done that.
You mentioned how Israel helped create Hamas in a sense. Hezbollah most probably wouldn't exist without the Israel occupation of southern Lebanon. And I call those events original sins. When we talk about Iran, that would be the CIA regime change in 1953, which installed the Shah instead of democratically elected prime minister. That set the stage for the 1979 Islamic Revolution. You worked inside the international institutions for decades. How much does this original sin still shape how Iran engages with the West and how the world preserves a Western legal claim?
Exactly. So yeah, so the removal of Mossadegh reveals that the US and the West, the UK and the US in particular, but the West in general, are not exactly about democracy, because you did have a democratically elected leader, and that was removed in the interest of making sure that their oil interests and their access to the oil interests was restored through the resumption of the rule of the Shah. And in this case, it was the son of the Shah who became the Shah back in 1953, as you said. So that is one stage. The Khomeini revolution, the institution of the Ayatollah regime, is not the right historical answer to that. You don't replace one form of tyranny with another form of tyranny. What you do is you strive to give self-determination to the people of Iran, a great people with a great history and a great culture, and who have yet to be given the chance to rule democratically or to be ruled democratically. So again, we saw it in Iraq, where the U.S. pretended that it was about bringing democracy to the Iraqi people. Now they're pretending that it's about, of course, they've named a million different pretexts for this war, whether it's self-defense, which is laughable, whether it's to end the nuclear program, equally laughable, because there was, according to the Omani mediator, who made a very public and very honest statement that the negotiations were fruitful and did create a path to peace, a peaceful resolution. So that can't be it. Whether it's the oil remains to be seen. Whether it's about changing the geostrategic balance in the region remains to be seen. So again, those double standards abound. However, they're not the only ones that are the Arabs themselves. We can condemn Iran, we can condemn Israel, but where is our condemnation of what's happening in Sudan? Where is our condemnation of the conflicting alliances over Libya, over Yemen, over a million other things? Where is our support? Where was our support to the Iraqi people when the international sanctions killed 500,000 Iraqi children? We normalize that as well. So our double standards abound. There's not only one region or one group of states or one economic caste of states that is guilty of double standards. We're all guilty of double standards. And by failing to enforce the charter, by failing to enforce accountability for those who violate the charter, that's another form of double standard across the board. Again, I mean, the double standards, if you're talking about double standards, I mean, let's talk about it in general. Yes, the West has double standards. There's no question about it. The EU applauded Putin's arrest warrant by the ICC, but within days or weeks said that they would not honor the arrest warrant against Netanyahu, throwing the ICC under the bus. They were willing to throw the JCPOA under the bus in hopes of getting Trump's support in Ukraine, but they got neither. They lost the JCPOA, and they're more and more assuming the responsibility for the war in Ukraine. But the double standards aren't just in the West. The double standards are everywhere else as well. Because China, for instance, talks about this, what do they call it? The Global Governance Initiative, and about the return to the principles of the Charter. And they talk about the return to the multilateral order. But they too are wielding their power in some places without regard to the rules of the game. The human rights violations against the Uyghurs is just one example. The threats of use of force against Taiwan is another. To the extent that the international order considers Taiwan and Hong Kong and all of these Tibet and others as provinces of China is respected. That's part of the international law. That's part of the international order. But you have an obligation to treat the people of those areas with the same human rights that are treated in the mainland. So again, violations there. So you talked about the Syria chemical weapons thing. This was maybe a point of success, where Russia and the U.S. came together. They vowed to address the red lines of the use of chemical weapons, which not only violates the charter, but it violates rules dating back to 1925 and even earlier, even before the creation of the United Nations. The use of chemical weapons, even against soldiers, is prohibited, not just against civilians. And the address to that, rather than more violence and more war, was to set up the elimination and destruction of those chemical weapons. The world united, the Security Council united, but they ignored the much bigger crimes happening around. The number of people killed as a result of chemical weapons, each life being sacrosanct, was a minutia of a fraction of the ones that were being killed by conventional weapons. By the Assad regime, by the Russians, by the allies who were there to destroy ISIS, and by ISIS. There was no similar regard, no similar convergence of power and principle to address those losses of life that remain unaccounted for, because there is no sanctions against Syria at the international level. And what have we done? We've taken somebody who's a former Al-Qaeda terrorist and made him the president of Syria. God help us all. And God help the minorities in Syria who will have to face the consequences of that decision. And we're normalizing that. mm, I fully celebrate the departure of Assad, but is that the best person to replace him? Let's To the extent that he's there, let's hope that he has learned the lessons of his past and forges a brighter future for his people. But we must remain cautious. We must have safeguards. We must have conditionalities for the support that he's receiving.
Up until now, for small countries, the United Nations and international law were the only two levers that they had in the international arena, something like a firewall between them and the powerful nations. What happens to them if the United Nations and international law are gone, if we ever come to that point?
I think this is precisely why you see that it is those small, but I believe powerful, you can be small and powerful, states that are defending the order. That's why you have South Africa in the ICJ trying to stop the genocide. You have the genocide in Gaza. You have Gambia trying to stop the genocide in Myanmar. You have Pacific Island states trying to stop the nuclear testing and nuclear proliferation. You have the obligation for disarmament that has yet to be fulfilled. Also, small states taking cases to the ICJ. You have the submissions by small states to the ICC. So they're using the system that the international community has created in order to address these violations, and they're being penalized for it. There's sanctions against South Africa. There's an effort to freeze out, to diplomatically marginalize those who are seeking to uphold the UN Charter, and those who are seeking to uphold international law are being punished. Those who are violated are being rewarded with multi-million and oftentimes trillion-dollar transactional deals, and those who are trying to defend the system are either mocked and or penalized with sanctions. Even on the individual level, you take somebody like Francesca Albanese, who's fulfilling a UN mandate given to her by the entire world, and she's trying to uphold the law, and she's now facing terrorist grade sanctions, as if she was a terrorist. The one who's defending the law and defending the children of Gaza is the one under sanctions, but the one who is killing those children and violating the law is applauded in Congress. So we're a long way from where we should be in terms of our values and our willingness to stand for those values.
Before we finish, let's do a quick lightning round, short questions, short answers. Is the International Criminal Court a lion without teeth, or we are simply not letting the lion out of the cage?
I don't think it's a lion. I think it's the conscience of the world. It needs to be supported both politically and financially, and it was never meant to be the one with the teeth. The teeth is the Security Council. The teeth is the member states, the states parties and the non-states parties. The teeth is the willingness of the world to recognize war criminals and not to draw distinctions between war criminals. Aggression is aggression. Genocide is genocide. War crimes are war crimes. It shouldn't matter who's committing them. When they're being committed, the individuals committing them should be held accountable equally. The law should apply equally, both in terms of the enjoyment of rights as well as in the accountability for violations of those rights. And when we don't have that equal enjoyment and that equal application of the law, that's the biggest double standard.
If you could delete one word from the UN Charter to make the world safer, what word would it be?
I've never thought of that. Many people talk about adding words. I'm going to answer you in a disappointing way. I'm, as you can see from the book, which I co-edited with Florian Laveau, I must say, if I haven't already mentioned that, and authored by multiple distinguished diplomats and practitioners from every region of the world. Our focus is on dealing with the charter as it is. It's very dangerous to think about opening it up, even for one word. Because if you open it up at a time like this, where we have such weak leadership and such, I would say, criminal leadership around the world, we're going to get something worse. We're not going to get something better. And even if we do get something better, the likelihood of it ever entering into force is very dangerous. So I don't want to waste time wishing away any word or trying to change any word. I want to deal with reality as it is. We have tools at our disposals. We have powers at our disposal. We just need to use them.
After 30 years in the backrooms of international law, what still makes you optimistic when you read the news?
Nothing. I'm not optimistic. What I am is recognizing that in order to save ourselves on a practical level, we have to come back to these basic principles. If we don't, it's on all of us. We will all suffer the consequence. So I'm hoping that pure self-interest, I'm hoping that pure self-preservation, I'm hoping that pure rational thought will allow us to recognize that it is in our interest to save ourselves by taking this roadmap to peace, prosperity, and justice that the UN Charter represents, with its flaws, with its failures, and come back to what we promised we would do just a year and a half ago, is to commit ourselves to those principles, to respect those prohibitions, and to continue to work for the dignity of every human being, for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of every state, and for the aspiration of mankind to live in a society that respects the dignity and worth of the individuals and the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of the state. Those are basics that we have all signed up for. Every single state has signed up for that. We just need to live up to it.
Right now, Venezuela, Iran, or Gaza, which poses the greatest legal threat to survival of the United Nations system?
It's the same threat. Israel could not do what it's doing without U.S. support, whether under the previous president or the current one. The Iran is attacked by Israel and the U.S. Venezuela is attacked by the U.S. and oil is now flowing to Israel. It's the same two parties, Israel and the U.S., that stand at the forefront of all three of those conflicts. But I would add, I don't think it's just those three, and I think it's a particular narrative that we focus on those three. And I don't in any way want to say that we should dismiss those three. But what's happening in Sudan is is just as much of an atrocity. What's happening in Ukraine is just as much of an atrocity. What's happening to the Uyghur people is just as much an atrocity. We we really have a lot of work to do, and I'm not going to prioritize one people or another, one border over another, even my own, because if we let any part of it break, we're letting it all break. We need to stand up for those principles everywhere they're being violated.
Ms. Khalil, one should admire your dedication to the international law and the system of United Nations, your trust that you still have in the system. But what is the substitution for UN if it disappears? How does the world look like in that situation? And will we collectively need to pass through the period of chaos until we figure out what is the next best solution?
Again, I mean, I'm constantly having this conversation with people. They're like, "Oh, you're so naive. Why do you believe in the UN? You're so naive. Why do you believe in international law?" Because without it, we can't call a war a war. Without it, we can't call a war crime a war crime. So it's in my interest to uphold the international law, even if it's being violated, because at least I have a name for the violation. Without the law, then I'm enabling the criminals, because then what they do isn't criminal anymore. Then it's the law of the jungle again. So if I want to give sanctity to human life, if I want to honor borders, and I want to honor the obligation to respect that life and to respect that border, then I have to not only advocate for the respect for international law, I have to advocate for accountability for violations of that law. So at the end of the day, we are we need to ask ourselves, even if you got rid of the UN, it's often said if you get rid of the UN, you have to reinvent the UN. But for those, okay, so let's say, this dystopia suddenly disappears and we have a utopia. Are you going to be able to have a functioning organization without the US and Russia or China? You're still going to have to bring them in. You're still going to have to bring them into the fold. Or you're going to have to develop strengths that can neutralize their strengths if you want to be in opposition to them. So what system is going to do that? Will it not suffer from the same deficiencies and the same constraints that the UN currently suffers from, whether they be financial constraints or legal constraints? So why waste our time with the unrealistic when the urgency of the imperatives of the necessities of the now are so great that we're better off relying on the tools that we have. And we have many tools. We have many powers. Civil society itself can change the course of history, as we've seen it do on the issue on issue after issue. We wouldn't even have an international criminal court if it wasn't civil society reminding the leaders of their promise to set up such a court, or the climate change, or the attention to the genocide in Gaza, or even the Darfur thing when it first began in the early 2000s. Nobody was paying attention until civil society started paying attention. When movie stars had to put it on the agenda. Now you have, for Darfur, you had George Clooney. Now you have Javier Bardem talking about. So civil society, celebrities, all of this power can also be tapped, can be harnessed, can be channeled, can be coordinated for the good. So at the end of the day, the UN Charter says we the peoples. Not we the people, but we the peoples. Not we the leaders, not we the governments, not we the nations. So that people power can be harnessed. But we need to be respectful of other people's lives and other people's causes, and remember that we are, at the end of the day, a human family. And when we behave more humanely and demand that our leaders behave more humanely, then we might have a better world and a better UN.
Ms. Khalil, for those who say that you are naive, I say three other words: nobility, determination, and principles. And thank you for all three of them. It was my pleasure to talk with you today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. You honor me, and I hope that that our vision of the human family is such that prevails, and not that the monsters amongst us are the ones that get to dictate our future.
Next week on Frontlines and Backrooms, Professor Richard Falk, one of the most influential scholars of international law, joins us to ask a fundamental question: is international law collapsed, or we will find new ways to organize the world? If you value long-form conversations that go beyond headlines and sound bites, consider subscribing to support the project. It is because of listeners like you that we are able to keep this backroom dialogue independent and in-depth. You can find the link to join in the show notes.